And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, David Wallace-Wells.
Thank you. So it's 107 degrees outside. Even though it's relatively comfortable in here, that's because there's like a factory of air conditioning going into this room. Many of us walked around this hotel, got sprayed by mist to make us comfortable in this heat. This is an area of the country that is already dealing with dramatic water shortages and will be dealing with many more dramatic shortages in the decades ahead. Many of us flew here, I include myself. Some of us on round-trip tickets across the country that are the equivalent of 8 months of driving in terms of carbon emissions. But I tell you all that not to make you feel uncomfortable, or not just to make you feel uncomfortable. I tell you that just as a context for what we're doing. And another piece of context I want to tell you about is me. So I'm a really unusual person to be talking about climate. I'm not an environmentalist. I've never even thought of myself as a nature person. I've never gone hiking. I've never had a pet. I've lived my whole life in cities, and I thought that nature was something that happened elsewhere. I knew that climate change was something we needed to worry about, but I also felt that modern life was a fortress against the forces of nature. And I've spent the last couple of years digging really deeply into climate science, talking to climate scientists, reading their research closely, and I now understand just how deeply diluted that idea is. The late climatologist Wallace Smith Broker calls nature an angry beast. I like to think of it as a war machine, and we're arming it more every day. That is happening incredibly quickly. Contrary to what you might have heard, contrary to what I was told as I was growing up, climate change is not a slow process. It is incredibly fast. So fast that actually, you can't even imagine the scale of changes that are going to happen over the course of this century. Now, most people, when they talk about climate, will talk about the future. So if I was doing that, I would tell you that by 2100, thanks to climate change, we could have a global GDP that was 30% smaller than it would be otherwise. That's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. We could have $600 trillion in climate damages, which is double all the wealth that exists in the world today. We could have 6 climate-driven natural disasters hitting a single location on the planet at once. We could have twice as much war because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. And our agricultural yields could be 50% the size as they are today. We'd be using them to feed probably 50% more people. So if I was going to tell you about the future, I would tell you those stats. But I actually want to talk about the history. And the history is incredibly remarkable. Like I said a minute ago, this is all moving so quickly that you could almost choose arbitrarily what benchmarks, what points in time to look at, and the data would be completely astonishing. But since this is largely a tech conference, I wanted to roll it out for you. In 2007, when the iPhone was released, the carbon concentration in the atmosphere was 386 parts per million. That can seem a little abstract, it's just a number. But conservative scientists believed that 400 parts per million was the level past which we couldn't cross without risking truly, truly catastrophic impacts. So we had a buffer of 14 parts per million. In the 12 years since, we've added 39. To look at Facebook, Facebook was founded in 2004. Since 2004, 30% of all of the emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity have been produced just since 2004. If you take it back to the invention of the internet, more than half of all of the emissions that we've produced in all of the millennia of human existence have been produced in the last 30 years. This is happening incredibly, incredibly fast. I'm 36 years old, which means my life contains this entire story. When I was born, the planet's climate was stable. Scientists were worried about the near term, the medium term, the long term, but in the near term, everything was okay. Today, we are at the brink of catastrophe, and that is because of what we have done just in those last 30 years. We are already entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history. So everything we know about how humans evolved, how we developed agriculture, developed rudimentary civilization, developed modern civilization. Everything that we know about the way we interact and organize our societies is a result of what we've done under climate conditions that no longer prevail. It is as though we've landed on an entirely different planet with a different set of climate conditions, and now we have to figure out how much of what we've smuggled along with us can endure, can live, can thrive in this new world. That is the story of the last 30 years, but the story of the next 30 years is just as consequential. Scientists say that we have about that much time to avert worst-case impacts, about 30 years, which means, again, I'm 36 years old. My lifetime will contain, God willing, that story too. And that's true of nearly everyone in this room. This is a story that we used to only recognize in mythology and theology. In 30 years, we damaged the planet so intensely that we now have only 30 years to solve the problem. And we are all living that story ourselves, not just as passive observers, which is what a lot of people think as they imagine the scale of the drama, but as protagonists, which raises the question, what are we doing? Maybe even more pointedly, what are you doing? Now, I often get asked when I talk about climate what individuals can do, and to that, my answer is almost invariably, individual consumption choices and behavior doesn't matter all that much. This problem is too big to solve through that method. What we need is policy, which means that the most important thing that anyone can do is politics. That's my answer to the average questioner at the average event I do. But this is not a room of average people. This is not an average industry. And I think when you look at the record of the tech industry generally on climate change, you have to say it's not doing nearly enough. It's not to say that it's not doing anything. I'm a huge admirer of Elon Musk and Tesla and Solar City. I wish he would focus on those more than SpaceX, but that's a conversation for another time. I think Bill Gates has done amazing work through Breakthrough Ventures, and all the people who are associated with that are doing incredibly vital work. A lot of companies have really reimagined how they do their own business to modify their own carbon footprints, and that's valuable. And last year, Y Combinator put out a call for some kind of far-out solar geoengineering startup proposals. I think that's valuable too. But when you take in the grand ambition of this industry, which is run by people who want to see their companies as world historical forces and see themselves as world historical figures, and you realize that we are living through an existential crisis, I think there is no way to say that tech, Silicon Valley, it's true of all of us, but I think it's acutely true in this industry, are doing anything close to what we need done. Now, why is that? I'm an outsider, but I have a few theories. The first is that for a long time, people thought there wasn't much money in it. I think there actually is some evolving thinking. Economists now believe that there are much greater economic, financial, business opportunities out there through faster action than slower. I think that may start to change things a little bit. I think that the logic of venture capital has also been a problem, where we think that scalability is so important that anything that actually costs something to build, some real-world item, is not going to be as attractive as something that can be scaled entirely through coding. And I think this is a business that is run largely by people who see themselves as engineers and coders and tend to see the problem set defined by what they can conceivably achieve through engineering and coding. And when there are other problems, political problems, social problems, outside of that purview, it's a lot harder for them to take action or even to recognize the problem as a problem. But my last hypothesis is the one that actually worries me the most, and it's true of me as a user and really all of the billions of people who use tech as much as it is about the people who are creating this technology. And that is that we're being distracted by the worlds on our phones and on our screens, and not actually looking at the world as it is outside of our windows, degraded every day by our own hands. And the tech industry has heard a lot about distraction over the years. I think a lot of that research is actually sort of overblown and not worth taking all that seriously. But I worry that a generation from now, we will look and see tech addiction as adaptive, because the world will be so ugly outside our windows that we comfort ourselves by looking so exclusively at the devices in our hands and fail to reckon with the dramatic changes unfolding in the real world, and which demand immediate response. I don't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in a world where I look at my phone because I don't want to look out the window. And that means that we all have to change course very quickly. And that goes for me, it goes for everybody in the world, but I think it really goes especially for the people in this room and all the people you work with, for whom there are huge opportunities out there to make a difference in this existential crisis if we just choose to focus our attention, our capital, and our intelligence on the problem. It's not just one thing that's going to solve climate change. The problem is way too big for that. There won't be a single silver bullet solution. But if everybody in the world who's mindful of the future is focused on how they can help address the problem, then hopefully 30 years from now, we'll be able to put down our phones and look at the real world and not feel too guilty about what we failed to do when we had the chance. Thank you.